going to start off, it's going to be a little bit of a good news, bad news sort of presentation. I'll spend the first 10 minutes sharing with you some highlights on trends that we've seen in animal agriculture, a lot of the benefits, and then the last 20 minutes I'll focus primarily on the regulations side of things. Okay, so the first of the two studies was one where we were calculating the beneficial impact of animal agriculture in terms of production, employment, and even the taxes that they generate. The second study that I mentioned is we were looking at the focus on how they would impact consumers and producers in terms of costs and in terms of food safety as well. We did, a few years ago, we completed a study that was along similar lines, estimating the costs to industry of shifting egg production to cage-free. And at that time, we found that the cost would be substantial, and I'll bring that up again a little bit later in the presentation. So where are we getting our information? So for the first study, we were pulling production data straight from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And we then, there's a modeling service that the Department of Commerce has called RIMS, where they provide multipliers that we could then use to estimate the impact of animal agriculture. The second study was really one where we cast a wide net asking the question, what sorts of regulations are on the horizon or potentially on the horizon, and what kind of costs would those mean depending on how they're imposed. And so for that we cast a pretty wide net, and we were looking at a lot of things, in particular at what evidence do we have out there that actually quantifies some of these costs so that we can then make some estimates as to what the impact might be. All right, so good news first. Most of U.S. animal agriculture expanded between 2000 and 2010. This includes pork, broilers, eggs, milk. Cattle was the only segment that declined in volume. Most segments were hit during the 2009 recession and bounced back again in 2010. Over the next dozen slides, we'll go quickly through. Hopefully the visuals will be of interest to you all. So these bar graphs show production, total volume. Nationally, cattle production has decreased by about 3.4% over the last 10 years. We're actually in the process of updating this for 2011, so we'll have 2001 to 2011 numbers. Again, it's funded by the Soybean Board, and those should be available in the June-July timeframe. Okay, so visually, so this shows how the total production of cattle has shifted within the U.S. over the past decade. So green indicates growth, and red indicates decline. The stronger the color, the stronger the change. So dark green would be strong growth, and bright red would be strong decline. I'd also note here that some of the stronger colors we're seeing in the Northeast, for example, red and Hawaii green, they don't matter quite as much simply because those are states that have pretty small herds. But as you can see here, there's a lot of pink all across the country, and that really reflects the fact that there's been some decline in cattle production. Hogs and pigs. Production increased 18% over the decade. It peaked in 2008 and declined slightly over 2009, 2010. If you want to see what happened in terms of production shifts, pretty substantial, given the fact that there was overall growth. So, as before, shades of green indicate growth and red decline. Blue are states where data has been withheld. Usually that's because there are so few producers they don't want to disclose the results of individual operations. Generally, you can see that pork production has shifted from the periphery of the country, particularly the coastal states, and moved toward the Great Plains, Midwest, and to a band of states in the West. Broiler production, similar to pork, increasing by about 1.5% a year, topping 50 billion pounds in 2008, a decline in production in 2009, and then recovery in 2010. What's happened with broilers nationally? Well, there's a lot of the white states are ones that don't have substantial production, and blue data is withheld. But as you can see, pretty strong growth in many areas. Turkey we've excluded. There's simply too many states either not reporting or that don't have production, so I've excluded that. Eggs. Production has increased steadily, about 1% a year. Hit an all-time high in 2010, 91.4 billion eggs. Egg production has shifted much closer into the corn and soybean producing regions. Despite the growth in national production, there have been declines in production across the South and the South and East and along most of the West Coast. The most prominent growth has been in the Midwest. Milk has been, like eggs, increasing, about 15% over the 10-year period. Production, almost 192 billion pounds in 2010. Nationally, the shift in milk production is unusually stark. So there have been declines across the South and the eastern states, and the growth, much of it substantial, virtually everywhere west of the Mississippi. Okay, so what's the bottom line in terms of impact? So these are the bottom line numbers. This has been calculated by adding up individual state totals. Animal agriculture generates over $280 billion in economic activity in the national economy, more than $50 billion in wages, over 1.8 million jobs, 12.7 billion in tax revenues, and over 6 billion in property taxes. The true impact on both state economies and the national economy is even greater than what's listed here for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't include any of the data that's been withheld, so that hasn't been factored into these numbers. So our numbers will tend to underestimate the true impact. Also, we used to have national multipliers, which have historically been about twice the size of the state multipliers, which we use. So the actual impact is likely to be on the order of $500 billion. Looking at the 10-year change alone, so these are the numbers over and above what we had in 2000. 23 billion additional dollars in economic output. Over 4 billion more dollars in earnings. Almost 130,000 more jobs than in 2000. And over $800 million in additional taxes. So plotting this on the map, you can see there are 10 states that generated over $1 billion in more output as a result of animal agriculture when comparing with 2000. Those are California, Idaho, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, North Carolina, Ohio, and Oklahoma. The change in wages are similar. If anything, you see the regional changes are more pronounced. I'm going back and showing you here. Income, wages. In terms of jobs, most states benefiting additional jobs due to animal agriculture. Those benefiting the most, Iowa, California, Idaho, and Michigan. The states that lost the most jobs were Colorado, Florida, Arkansas, Utah, and Louisiana. And before moving on to the second study, just wanted to focus here for a second on the export angle. So consumption of animal ag products, for the most part, stable on a per capita basis in the U.S. A lot of the real growth is in exports. The latest figures I recall seeing were something on the order of 25 to 30% of what we produce in animal ag gets exported. We're the largest exporters of turkeys and eggs in the world, second largest for pork and chicken, and we're third in beef exports. We export close to twice as much as we import, and our net trade is a positive $11 billion. Well, that's the good news. Now rolling into the bad news. So this is a study where we were looking at quite a few things. Regulations specifically, what might be the impact, and how would it impact producers, consumers, in terms of food safety costs, what would be the impact for consumers. And as I said, we cast a wide net. We looked at not only production in the U.S., but we also looked at a couple of different systems. Mexico, which is a net importer of our products, but also a competitor in some cases, and Brazil, which is a growing competitor overseas in these markets. And what we settled in on was 5 areas where we felt that regulations over the short to medium term were most likely to come up, and and perhaps we'd see some regulations that would have an impact. This is really a moving target, so there's some things that aren't quite as in the news now as they were a year ago. There are probably some new things. So it's a snapshot of what we were seeing last year. And these 5 areas were animal housing, some of the most prominent issues around group housing, sow stalls, tethers, environmental regulations, many of those restrictions placed on large operations, for instance, to regulations on pollutants, gas emission rules, and others. Subtherapeutics, so here it was primarily objections to the use of antibiotics in low doses to keep animals growing healthy and efficiently. Labor issues were a hot topic last year, particularly given some new laws that were passed in several states, such as Arizona and Alabama. And the final issue, when we were sort of waist deep in this project, was the livestock marketing rules, the GIPSA rules, that would have shifted the burden of proof of anti-competitive activity from suppliers to the processors and increased the regulatory burden on livestock buyers and potentially increasing litigation as well. So I'll go through these one by one. You will have heard already this morning the case of the UK was one of the major case studies that we used in our research. One of the benefits, obviously, of using case studies is learning from the experience that others have had, and so we definitely benefited from at least seeing what happened in the UK. Just a couple of things to highlight there, and that is that based on the outcomes that we saw from the UK study, we figured that in the US our estimate was that a comparable impact would be about $5.8 billion in capital costs that the industry would have to spend, and another $1.1 billion in operating costs each year. I mentioned earlier a study we did on the potential costs of transitioning to cage-free egg production. In that study, we found that would drive consumer costs up by about 25%, which is roughly 42 cents for a dozen eggs, and with an overall price tag of about $2.6 billion. We've also seen some examples closer to home. So Florida and Colorado have both issued self-imposed bans over the past decade. Florida had sow stall rules. Colorado regulated feedlot operations. It's really more of an environmental regulation, but we included it here because a lot of the outcomes were similar. Both states suffered, as a consequence, significant drop in production. Colorado hog inventories dropped by 20%, production dropped by 50%. And what we came to learn pretty quickly looking at all these case studies is that when there aren't barriers to trade, either between one state or another, or in the case of the UK, between other countries, what you find is that the local producers are hurt, and the jurisdiction is still going to bring the products in. Environmental regulations, they come in many flavors, so we didn't have number estimates because so many things could go on here. We found there was particular pressure to regulate feeding operations, waste issues, whether it's particulate matter, gas emissions, or discharge. So we didn't quantify because there's so many variables here. But we have lots of cases where we've seen the costs associated with environmental. Subtherapeutics. So this is an area where we've seen a lot of activity in Europe, and not so much in the US so far. The basic objection is to the use of antibiotics in low levels to keep animals growing efficiently and healthy. We have a couple case studies from overseas. Sweden was the first country to institute a subtherapeutic antimicrobial ban in 1986. And what they saw was they had significant drops in efficiency initially. Then they were able to make some adjustments, but production costs remained higher, about 1%. But Sweden isn't exactly a great case study in the sense that they're a very high-cost producer. So the impact on somebody that's more competitive, we felt would be a lot more significant. A better case study in our view was Denmark. Denmark is unique in that they do a lot of tracking. So they track in great detail the use of antibiotics in both animals and in humans, and they track the resistance patterns of bugs that those antimicrobials are meant to fight against in both animals and humans. So they've been collecting a lot of data over the past 15 years or so. And what they found was that initially when they eliminated subtherapeutics, and that took place in 2000. Overall antibiotic use dropped, but since then, the use of antibiotics for therapy to actually treat illness in the animals has gone up significantly. So graphically, the blue line is subtherapeutics, and red is the treatment antibiotics. So in 1994, they began reducing the number of antibiotics they were using, and by 2000, that zeroed out. It was no longer allowed. Most antibiotics on subtherapeutic level in Denmark are used in pork production, pig production. And what you can see, the red line, so that's actual therapy, it increased dramatically once they banned the subtherapeutic use. And in terms of resistance patterns, because the argument is we need to save these. We should only be using them when they're needed, and we shouldn't be using them subtherapeutically. But they've had very mixed results from that they've been tracking. So what they've seen is that some resistance patterns have showed declines, which is a good thing, but in other cases they can't find those clear connections. One thing that we do know from the production side, though, that when you eliminate subtherapeutics, there's a greater incidence of animal sickness, production efficiency drops, litter sizes decrease, and feed conversion ratios all drop. And the Animal Health Institute, based on its own data review, estimates that in the U.S., eliminating subtherapeutics would require an additional 452 million chickens, 23 million cattle, and 12 million hogs just to match our current level of production. The fourth area we looked at was labor issues, enforcement. To the extent that states pass bills tightening documentation checks, instituting criminal penalties for failing to enforce and report, such as the law that was passed last year in Alabama, these things could negatively affect the labor available both for raising animals and in processing industries. Decreasing the labor pool obviously raises costs, which would ultimately be reflected in consumer prices. And the last issue we looked at, which is one that surged and subsided in 2011. So these were the livestock contracting and marketing rules. USDA did send a final version to OMB, but there was a lot of opposition, and it was blocked in appropriations in mid-November. In terms of overall, the 5 areas we singled out. So this table shows 5 areas down the first column, and then what we saw as how likely these regulations are to be pushed, what their impact on production costs would be, where the pressure was coming from, and whether if when push came to shove, whether there's any benefit at all. If regulations were to put in place, is there anything at all in it for the producers? In most areas, we saw that the pace of change is unlikely to be high. There's been some pressure in some of these areas for years, but it doesn't take much sometimes. I think as we've seen over the past couple months with some issues really flaring up, for something to light a fire that leads to the imposition of regulation. And where we saw the areas most likely to have a high impact would be animal housing and environmental regulations, and this is mostly because of the high capital costs that would be required to comply with regulations. And most of the pressure for these regulations is coming from regulators, not from consumers. Environmental issues are mostly driven by the EPA in the states. Consumers usually aren't involved unless it's a local issue. The impact of labor rules on animal agriculture, that's really a side effect of labor regulation in general. It's not one that targets animal agriculture per se. And the livestock marketing issue wasn't even a consumer issue at all. What we've seen is that some of the areas where consumers are more vocal are animal housing and subtherapeutic antibiotics. And these may be areas where at the margin there's an opportunity to capture a premium from consumers. So lots of potential regulations. We had a sense of what costs generally were. And what we did was we analyzed 2 scenarios. One, we made an assumption, okay, what happens if production costs go up by 10%? And certainly, if any one of these areas saw significant regulation, that's a feasible figure. What impact would that have? And then what if you got several regulations at once and you drove production costs up by about 25%? Well, we used an economic model that looked at price elasticities, which is a fancy way to say when prices go up by a certain amount, how much less do consumers buy, even accounting for the fact that they shift from one product to another sometimes. And what we saw was that in the 10% scenario, consumer costs would go up by about $6.8 billion per year on an ongoing basis. And in the 25% scenario, $16.8 billion per year. There was another impact, and this came from the export side. So driving up production costs would make us less competitive overseas. And it would reduce, in the 10% scenario, our exports by about $440 million, which would cost about 3,500 jobs. And in the 25% scenario, it would be over $1 billion and over 9,000 jobs. The final piece that we looked at was the food safety side. So we looked at the US system, Brazil, Mexico. We looked at the data available, which unfortunately, that's the one thing that really came out of this, is that we really don't collect a whole lot of data on food safety, and other countries do a worse job than we do. We have estimates both for the number of illnesses and the cost per illness, but these are things that get revised sometimes in a major way. So last year they revised the number of illnesses down by about 50%, and that isn't because we have 50% fewer illnesses than 10 years ago, it's because they've changed the methodology. The overall impact is estimated at, I think the most recent number is about $75 billion per year. We have over a dozen agencies that are responsible for food safety, and we do a poor job of tracking. Another major trend, and one of the reasons we looked into this, was that food imports have been growing rapidly, not only in the volumes we buy, but also the number of different products. Predictive systems are increasingly being used to help focus on the shipments that are most likely to cause illness, but we only test a tiny, tiny fraction of what comes in. In order to ship meat and poultry products to the US, our government has to certify that a foreign government has an acceptable food safety system. In the case of Brazil and Mexico, which we looked at, neither of them does. So they're not allowed to ship raw product to the US. Canada is actually the only country that ships eggs to us. I'd add, though, that some of these large businesses are multinational, so we have some large production facilities in the US that are owned by Brazilian companies. So what's the bottom line? First, regulations increase production costs, ultimate cost to the consumer, and they have a negative effect on demand. We learned that jurisdictions that are early to adopt self-imposed regulations, whether it's the UK or Florida or Colorado, those that don't apply to the nearby competitors, they end up damaging their own producer industry. Meat and poultry for the domestic market is unlikely to move overseas in the short term. We're very cost competitive here. We don't face many costs that our competitors do to get products to our market, and in many cases they're not eligible to export to us anyway. The primary threat of regulations, as we saw it, was to exports in terms of sales. Obviously there's the consumer impact and an effect on demand there, but we'd be especially hurt overseas. So where competition is, where there's much more competition, and any regulations that drive up costs here would make us less competitive there. And in the end, we found that there just isn't enough concrete evidence to show that food safety would worsen if we were to import more products.